Well, it's a real pleasure to get to be here so close to the holidays in particular. I love Christmas time. It's my favorite time of year. And you get to talk about archaeology during Christmas time. How could it get much better? All right, so this talk's going to focus on one element, the analysis of the artifact assemblage at the Blueberry site. I've had the wonderful opportunity, as Kevin said, to be there for quite a few years now and conduct detailed analytical studies of most of the artifact categories at the site. And this is going to talk about the marine shell assemblage. This is going to report on a sample of the marine shell assemblage that was analyzed in the last couple of years and is going to be the topic of a forthcoming article that will probably end up in the Florida Anthropologist. I was grateful to have, as Kevin mentioned, Nate Loers as my co-author with this article, and another of my assistants from the dig that's been there since 2005 is Ryan Murphy. And he's the Sarasota County archaeologist now, very proud of him. He was a student of mine at UCF in 2002. I was at UCF from 2002 to 2005. This is information you guys don't need to know, but why not blurt it out? Then I was at Rollins for 2 or 3 years, and I've been at Full Sail. It'll be 6 years in March. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm a Florida native and an Orlando native. I was born at Winter Park Memorial, which is now some sort of Florida hospital thing. All right, so this is my neighborhood, and I'm really glad to be here. All right, so this gives us a little bit of background, kind of a summary of some of the characteristics of the Blueberry site. All right, this is, of course, in my opinion, the most important site in South Central Florida. All right, but evidence is demonstrating that it is a very significant site. It's the northernmost ceremonial center or village site, large ceremonial village site. The site covers, we know it's up there. You don't see it up there, it might be on a forthcoming slide, but it's about 65 acres. So it's a fairly large village site. One of the neat things about the site with regard to the third bullet point down, Belle Glade Plain Pottery, this site has the most Belle Glade Plain pottery of any site in the state. I'm currently in the throes, I should say, of an article that focuses just on the Belle Glade pottery assemblage from the site. And we've identified more rim-shaped varieties at that site than have ever been found with Belle Glade pottery. So when you have a plainware, Belle Glade pottery doesn't have a lot of decoration on it. It's very, very normal looking, right? You have to focus on attributes other than surface decoration. So lip treatment and rim variation are the things that we focus on with that type of pottery. All right, wow, those are small on that side. Let's see. You guys can't read any of that, can you? Okay. People in the front row can. But this kind of sort of goes over some of the stuff I already said, right? We're talking about the significance of the site. Let's see, I've lost my pointer. That's okay, I don't need it. The Blueberry site is very interesting from a topographic perspective. The site sits right on the edge of what's called the Lake Wales Ridge, which is a prominent geomorphologic feature that runs from about Pine Hills down to about 20 miles north of Lake Okeechobee. It's a strip of high land. And it's very unique for lots of reasons. From an environmental perspective, there's lots of animals and plants and trees and interesting, unique components of the Florida landscape can be found there that aren't in other places. Site contains at least 2 mounds. The site's around 65 acres, has an intact sheet midden, black dirt midden in the most intensely occupied areas of the site that is chock full of intact features, which is wonderful. We've unearthed, since I've been there, over 200 intact post molds, about 5 completely intact hearths, dozens of pits. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be at a site with that kind of integrity, and I'm very grateful. Subsistence. Focus a lot on aquatic resources, especially fish. We've had 3 hearths completely analyzed, the entire matrix, took the whole thing out, the whole globe of dirt, and had all of the fauna and all the flora analyzed down to the smallest speck. And what we found is that from those samples is that about 80% of the diet was made up of catfish. Let's see. Another interesting component is bone tools, right? Shell tools, of course, are the focus tonight, but there's really good preservation of bone at the site, which is another very unique opportunity to study a category of artifacts. So the site is wonderful, and I'm very grateful to be there. All right, so when we think about marine shell at a site in the center of the state, right, the center of South Florida, we automatically, right off the bat, recognize that there's something cultural happening, right? The marine shell did not get itself to the middle of the state and become modified into artifacts, okay? We can see right off the bat we've got an opportunity to potentially explore trade and interaction, right? And since we've got good preservation of bone, that might infer that we've also got good preservation of shell, and we do. All right, so what are the primary categories of shell artifacts represented in the sample? The characteristics of the sample point to a strategic use of marine shells as a scarce resource. You'll see that they absolutely do, and that this is consistent with the study of lithics at the site, which is what the article is on in FAS this month. Basically, the article says a whole bunch of stuff, but can be boiled down into a couple of sentences. In an area where you don't have stone resources, you use the stone differently than you would if you were in a place that had ample stone resources. That might sound really simple, but normally when archaeologists study lithics, they're looking at reduction sequences relative to where the stone is located, and they don't think about where the stone isn't located. So it's a unique contribution to the literature in that we're looking at an environmental context without stone resources and analyzing it from that perspective. Lastly, what behaviors related to the production of shell tools or the utilization of shell tools can be inferred from the sample? All right, so we're going to look at cultural behavior related to the sample, how shell was used relative to how it might have been used if you were on the coast, and what the heck kind of shell tools are there. Oh wow. Something crazy just happened, but I think we're beyond it. Okay, so as we analyzed the sample, we found that there were two primary categories: utilitarian and personal adornment. And it's all imported shell, right? You see from the center of that graphic. And then we've got the four little categories of tool that we'll get into as we move through. First, we'll look at the utilitarian shell artifacts. We're going to see that there's a difference with regard to the ratio of utilitarian versus items of personal adornment at this site. We'll see that in a little bit. All right, this is an example of one of the tools from the site. This is, of course, a utilitarian tool. This was used as a hammer on this end. And I don't know how familiar everybody is with these types of tools. Maybe a little, but American Indians would put a stick through this shell, right, and utilize it as a hoe. That's one of the ways that the Spanish observed them firsthand utilizing this tool. But we also know that they were used as pounders and sometimes cutting-edge tools. But anyway, this is an example of how the tools come out of the ground at the site. All right, so this is really good preservation. This is another example. One of the interesting things about this one and another specimen that'll be in the talk is the size, the diameter of that hole is very unusual. That's not typical for this type of tool. And one potential use for that large circular disc would have been a carved gorget, which we have not found at the site, but that's a very possible use for that type of fragment of shell, right? And that's been found in lots and lots of places around the state. So that could be what that hole represents, or it just could have been that they used a large stick, okay? That's one of those archaeological questions that you don't want to overstep the evidence and pretend like you know more than you do, okay? So, or fool yourself or others into thinking you know more than you do. I'm a big proponent of being very cautious with regard to archaeological interpretation, which I think all good archaeologists are. That's not a unique thing with me, that's what I was taught. All right, so this just shows an interesting an interesting pattern that we found at the site is we found 3 different pits recently that have 2 of these large lightning whelk shell tools placed in the same pit and stacked on top of each other. All right, we know that they were placed purposely in the pit, and it's very likely that they were stored strategically for ceremonial purposes. This is from a mound context. All right, that's another example of a cutting-edge tool. This one shows, the last one was a little harder to see, but this shows one side that the stick would have gone through, right? And the stick would have come out that side. This is the same shell. This shows the 2 different sides. All right, so imagine a stick going through this shell, right? And this side of the shell would accommodate this end of the stick, and it would be coming out that smaller hole, or vice versa. All right, if you guys haven't seen, I don't know if you guys have seen this in books, but this is a standard Florida shell tool. All right, so one of the unique components of this assemblage, relatively unique components of this assemblage, is the reuse of the shell. All right, the same way stone would be discarded in a place where there was lots of stone, right? If we had lots of shell, if we had ample supply of shell, we would be less likely to reuse and repurpose this raw material. And this is an interesting example of the people at this interior site, 60 or so miles from the closest coast, reusing this raw material. If we were on the coast and we had these, if these were a dime a dozen, we wouldn't spend the time to reuse this raw material, right? We'd toss it over our shoulder and get another blank, right? Another shell to utilize. So this is an example of a reused cutting-edge tool. One that was strategically cut back so that a new edge could be created. Same shell, showing the remnants of one of those holes. Yes, it came on for a second. No, it's just out to get me. That's okay. All right, anyway, you guys see the half hole there, all right? And you can see how that's completely different than it was with the intact version of this tool. All right, this is another example of 2 of these shells being placed within just a couple centimeters of each other, found in the same pit feature. So the thing that this stresses from a cultural perspective is that they're taking the time to place these in the same orientation, and they're treating them with care, right? This is a ceremonial site, so that certainly has something to do with it. But we're not looking at a situation where folks have ample supply of something, they're breaking it down into what they want and leaving fragments and discarding partially made tools all over the place, which is what we see when we have lots and lots of raw materials. Okay, we see a pattern, evidence over and again is demonstrating a special use of this raw material because it was so rare. This is a very unique tool because the hole is in the wrong spot. All right, this is a tool that typically has the hole here, but the hole is in the other end, and there's a very interesting notch down here, which makes it look as though the shell was oriented, instead of the shell being oriented this way, with a stick going through like this, right, this shell was oriented this way, which means you had a shell that was up in the air, as opposed to one that was sideways. We can infer all sorts of potential ceremonial, I think of ceremonial activities when I think of that, and I think of that being some sort of a totem, right? We have evidence of other ceremonial totem-like objects from a mound context from the site, and that would be consistent with that. But again, I'm only going to suggest that's a possibility, as opposed to saying that's what definitely happened. Until I get my time machine, I can't go back and see that, and I have lots of other things I have to do before I can look at that when I get my time machine. Another example. This one is another good case for a potential gorget, or carved round disc. it would not make any sense for them to have put this hole that close to the edge, because it would have blown out, it would have broken, it would have snapped as they used it. All right, but it would make sense if they were trying to get a blank for something to carve, because that would be the flattest part of the shell. It would have the least amount of curve to it. When I find those, I'm going to refit them right into the shells, and voila, I'll be able to prove my idea. You know I'll never find them, ever. They're probably over on the West Coast, or up in the Carolinas. All right, so this one's interesting. This is split all the way down the middle. All right, so this has certainly been reused as well to recreate this cutting edge. You can see this is small. That's a centimeter scale on the right. All right, so this guy is only about this long and about this wide. All right, and these are some examples of some other typical types of shells that we find at ceremonial sites in the southeast. Right, a drinking cup, right, is very typical of ceremonial sites. In fact, ceremonial sites going all the way up into Missouri, right, have Florida shell. And we've got their copper, right? And we've got four, I might have checked my math, either 4 or 5 native copper artifacts from the site. Okay, and we know for sure that they're native copper because we've had them analyzed by Rob Tykot over at USF. He's hit them with the special beams and made special inferences based on how those beams bounce off the surface of the metal, all right, to determine that they are almost pure copper. All right, he does his fancy tests, gives us a report. We go, wow, it's real copper. That's a big deal because this site comes all the way up to almost historic times. Well, it does come up to historic times. All right, and what lots of folks were saying when I first got there was, you don't have any native copper there. It's all copper that they recovered from the coast and got from Spanish ships and brought back and reworked. I said, well then, why does the mint date back to 1200 AD? And they'd say, oh, you dates are wrong. So then I got 6 or 7 more of them. Then I got that test done. Then they shut their mouths. All right, so, interesting columella hammer. Right, this one is based off a black and white drawing that was done. But another interesting specimen. Right, the center of a whorl from a shell. Right, think of all the reduction it would take to get that work down into that. All right, this is actually not in great shape. All right, you can see this white chalky stuff. This thing is actually starting to break apart. I actually had to glue it back together there. But this is unique because it's a horse conch, right? Which is can be a very large specimen to work with. And this has very clear evidence of utilization. All right, this is a close-up of the cutting edge. This is very degraded. I was telling you a few minutes ago how wonderful things were preserved, right? But there's variation within that wonder. All right, and this edge is starting to go. On a side note, this is an interesting tool because it has a cutting edge and a perforator, right? This shows that rather than just taking the tool or taking the shell and utilizing it as an expedient tool and tossing it over your shoulder and grabbing the next one, they took the time to repurpose this and make 2 different applications out of the same small fragment. They wouldn't have done this if they had lots and lots of shell. We see the same thing at the site with stone, right? We see them reworking small points that they would throw into the creek if they had an ample supply of stone. So this is good because it shows a consistency with regard to their behavior. And it's consistent with what we see in the environment as well. Again, another example of repurposing. Right? That's kind of one of the most interesting things about the assemblage is being able to prove that. We went into it, we said, Ryan and I went into this study. We said, well, we don't really know what we're going to find, right? As a good scientist does, you go in with an open mind, you analyze the data, you look for patterns, you make inferences, and you prove what you can based on those patterns, right? And you ask a bunch more questions. So, another example of repurposing. And that's the end of one of those large, long columella fragments, right, that has been snapped off. Okay, so that's all of the utilitarian artifacts. All right, marine shell artifacts. A lot of pounders, a lot of cutters, perhaps some ceremonial things going on, and a drinking cup. Now let's look at some personal adornment. Let's look at what they were doing with shell to think of it as kind of an item that jewelry could be made out of. Think about that in relation to other sites. All right, personal adornment, we got two big categories. Yes, it's all imported shell. Beads and pendants. What we're going to see as we move through is that there's a much higher proportion of items of personal adornment than there normally would be at a site with lots of shell artifacts. Normally, there's a lot more utilitarian stuff, a whole lot more utilitarian stuff when compared to jewelry, right? But at this site, what we see, partially because this site is a ceremonial site, we have ceremonial activities going on, therefore we have artifacts that are associated with that behavior, right? So we have some folks with a lot of prestige at this site that have some very unique artifacts associated with their living space, right? We've had a greenstone pendant discovered, right? We've had soapstone duck, tiny little soapstone duck with very, very detailed carving, about this big, that was found in one of the two mounds. We've also found two tablets that were definitely associated with prestige and ceremony at the site. And we find a whole bunch of red ochre at the site. We have found thousands of red ochre fragments at the site. Some of them only this big, right? But some of them more like that. All right, so at a site where you have lots of red ochre, you have mounds, you have imported artifacts, right? You have a habitation that lasted from around 1200 to around 1700 AD. Got some interesting things going on. Okay, this is a really cool specimen. This still has red ochre, excuse me, tell by looking at it it's not red, yellow ochre on the pendant. All right, this was taken out of a pit feature. It has a very clear suspension hole. And what we're going to see in just a second is how significant this artifact is in relation to what was going on in other parts of North America. The whole Mississippian cult, dun dun dun, has these things all over the place. All right, these columella pendants are shown in engravings on copper and shell as far away as Missouri. All right, and you can see them around the neck, typically of dancing warriors. Right, so, which of course infers prestige when we're talking about somebody that's got this much garb on, right, and certainly ceremony. So these are a few examples, and here are a few more. All right, each of these has a columella pendant suspended around the neck, or what lots and lots of folks believe to be a columella pendant, and I agree with them. Certainly is consistent with what we see right there. All right, if you turn that thing up, put that suspension hole right here, let me make a really crazy pose for you, right? And then compare me with that. Come on, we're in there. That one I can stick my neck out for. All right, this is another really unique piece of jewelry from the site. You can see how tiny it is, right? It's only about this big. And there's actually a very worn place around the center of it. So, right there at the neck. So there's some wear around that suspension hole as well. But that's interesting that it has that wear around that area. Suggests that it could have possibly been attached to something else. In other words, if this is that little artifact, it could have been secured against something by having this portion of it show wear, all right, or it could have been worn. But there's definite use wear there, showing that there was something tied around that. This is another very unique specimen. This also has some red ochre left on it, some red ochre staining, and this has a suspension hole. And this is an apple murex shell that has been cut right down the middle. Very unique, right? You don't see these guys all the time. It's also polished, as was this yellow specimen. I don't know if I didn't point that out. This has been polished, all right? This isn't just the way that you normally find bone. This has been highly polished and then been stained with yellow ochre. All right, we've got the same thing with this apple murex. It's been polished as well. Some olive shell beads, all discovered together. Probably all part of the same necklace, but that's an inference. And this one is really cool. This is a piece of shell, and I've got to go forward and then back. From there, all right, from a queen conch. So we're not talking about folks bashing some shells together and coming up with some random shapes and using them to, you know, I don't know, gut fish or something, right? We're talking about a very precise, very meticulous craft, right? And if people are spending this much time to acquire this material, this much time to make these artifacts, that says something to me about the folks that are going to be wearing them. That's all the same bead, by the way, at different angles. This may be the first tooth implant in history. It's not a tooth. I'm making a joke. It's not. You guys don't know me well enough. It's not a tooth implant. All right, but it does look kind of like a tooth. All right, when you hold your hands about this big, it's about the size of a molar. All right, so Barbara was eating her shell salad, and she busted her tooth, and Joe made this for her, stuck it right in the hole, and everything was wonderful. Or they made that lovely bead and someone wore it on a necklace. Okay, so what are the primary categories of shell artifacts represented in this sample, right? We've got utilitarian, we've got jewelry. Okay, so what's unique about that with regard to this assemblage? We have a lot more personal adornment created from shell than we normally do at sites that have shell assemblages. What behaviors can be inferred from the sample? Cutting-edge tools probably used for woodworking. Items of personal adornment possibly worn by high-status individuals. We've discovered a small either canoe or something that would have accompanied a canoe and possibly could have carried supplies. Right? We found about 2 miles from the site something about half the length of this bench, right? About 3 feet long. All right, that was carved into the exact shape of prehistoric canoes that we've found all over the state. There's also been a carved bird of prey that was found about 1.5 miles north of the site, carved out of wood. It's in the Museum of History and Culture at the South Florida State College primary campus in Avon Park, that carved bird of prey. So we have examples of modified wood in the neighborhood, and it would have been very practical for them to utilize some of those utilitarian tools for modifying wood. We have some very interesting examples. So, do characteristics of the sample point to strategic use of marine shells as a scarce resource? Absolutely. Just in the sample that we utilized for this study, we show lots of repurposing and reworking within that study. Of the 30 items in the study, 12 were cutting-edge tools. So 75% of the utilitarian shell artifacts were cutting-edge tools. I just figured out what he was asking. Give me 1 second. Need a room. I love you too much. All right, so 14 items of personal adornment. So 46% of the overall sample was jewelry. That's a big deal. All right, it may not seem very exciting because it's shell, but from a research perspective, that's a big deal. All right, that's much different than we would typically find if we were looking at an assemblage of shell from an archaeological site from the state of Florida. 13 items demonstrating significant reduction. 2 items demonstrating debitage and reutilization. And this reduction is most likely associated with repurposing or reusing a tool that could have been discarded in an area where you had more raw materials. Oh no, I went forward. Here we go. All right, so public education and involvement. This is kind of some of what we have going on at the site. This is an example of an elementary school tour. We have a couple of different elementary groups that come out every year. I work with a high school group from Walker Academy in Avon Park. I have a science teacher bring out his field study science class every month. This year I've got about 9 students that come out. They come out every month. We dig at the site once a month. I'm there the 3rd weekend of each month, and we welcome visitors. Any of you guys would like to come out? We have a very hands-on experience. We have plenty of artifacts that come out, and if anybody is itching for experience and wants to see what an archaeological dig is like in a good setting, you guys are welcome to come down. Kevin's got my contact info. He's welcome to share that with anybody that would be interested. But make sure you prepare yourself for a day, in the outdoors if you wanted to come and visit. And you're welcome to do that. Let's see. This is a Walker class, right? This is an example of the students that come out. This was, I think, last year. There's Ryan Murphy, my partner in crime, next to me there. And this is Gordon Davis, the science teacher that brings his students out. Down here, this is Ann Reynolds, the owner of the property. Without Ann, there would be no archaeology at the Blueberry site. So I'm so grateful for her giving me the opportunity to conduct the research there. Yeah, I guess if I read the numbers, yes, it was last year, 2013, 2014. Let's see what else I'm saying up there. Yeah, I guess that's all I'm saying. And that might be the whole end of my shebang. It is the end of my shebang. Anybody have any questions? Certainly don't have to have questions. Go for it.
I have 2.
Sure.
First of all, who were the peoples that occupied the site? And I noticed that the one pendant bore a distinct resemblance to sort of female contours. Is there any significance in that, comparable to, say, some of the statuettes found in prehistoric caves in Europe?
Nice. A little Venus cult action. Why not? I love that. That was my first thought when I saw it. I'll address your second question first. Is there any way to prove that? Do we have a pattern of that behavior in the region? Do we have a history of there being female figurines associated with ceremony in the area at ceremonial sites? No. It's a unique specimen. But I absolutely see those similarities, and I saw them. That was my first thought when I saw it, was, oh my gosh, this is a female leader or a female deity or some sort of symbol related to feminine folks, right? People with those attributes with their body, right? So,
can you show me?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting. It really makes you think. What in the heck's going on there? Yeah. I mean, you see what you see. You see what you see, right? Not exactly very shapely, but maybe she's dancing or maybe she's walking, right? Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. All right, so yeah, I've had those same thoughts. Very interesting. Any way to prove that? Heck no, right? But certainly appears as though that could be part of what was going on, if not all of what was going on. Without a pattern of cultural behavior in a region, it's very hard to connect those dots. But this sets precedent for future research. So maybe 10 years from now, they find a couple of these someplace else, right? And we begin to build a pattern of ceremony and this type of object. But as of now, there isn't one. Which is kind of neat, but also would be nice if there were others to compare it to, right? So who those people were? I always get that question. Or typically get that question when there's smart people in the audience, right? Because the idea is, we're south of St. John's. We're north of the Okeechobee, right? So that's a neat thing about this part of the state. It's one of the reasons that I love having the opportunity to do research there. Nobody knows, right? These people were too far to the interior and too far south to have been bothered by the Spanish. Right? Everybody on the coast, everybody way down south, everybody up north by the Panhandle, coming all the way across the Panhandle, destroyed. Culture disrupted. Culture ruined through European contact. Culture destroyed, utterly destroyed. Right? People decimated through warfare and slave raiding. Right? These folks were here from a little before 1200 all the way up to about 1700. So this is very unique. We have a stable group of people from the center of the south of Florida. It's the only place in the state where we had a culture that lasted through that destruction that occurred, mostly due to the Spanish. So, we don't know who they were, right? There are some suggestions that they were affiliated with the Calusa, right? That they may have even been a tribe that was subservient to the Calusa. Right? It's been suggested by some people. What evidence do they have? None. Okay? We've got the same type of pottery created in the same area, the same types of houses, the same type of subsistence, same type of food-getting strategy that went on for around 500-600 years in the same place. So it's very unique. And I think it's wonderful that the Spanish never gave them a name.
And there's
good
no
for them.
mention in any of the surviving Spanish records of it.
There are a couple of suggestions that there was a significant village site north of Lake Okeechobee. I believe Fontaneda is the guy that mentions that, and it may have been mentioned by one or two other Spanish folks, but there were no Spanish folks that went to that site and referred to it specifically, and there's no definitive account of anyone being in that area. And I love that. I absolutely love that. The Spanish started coming south when they got close enough before Indians were decimated the way they were. They got wiped out. I think that's great. So they never made it any further south of the green swamp, right? When they were down around Lake Okeechobee, it was all nasty and swampy, and there weren't resources there for them to go after like gold. And there wasn't a good route to connect them militarily with another group of Spaniards. So there wasn't much motivation for them. The whole reason they messed with Florida was to try to connect Florida with Texas. They wanted a land route that would connect Florida with Texas. That was their hidden motivation that the vast majority of people don't know. That was mostly your question. Okay, there's another hand. Hi.
Most of the pictures right up there for the tools were lightning walk and horse walk, but the beads, they were all assortment of a different shell. Did you find that the data shows that they separated their shells for tools and personal use, or?
Well, you know what? Some of the items of personal adornment are made from shells, like the big horse conch bead. So, as far as them separating different categories of raw material for different applications, I don't know that we see that pattern in the data, but it's a really good thing to think about. And it's something that could emerge as we have a larger sample. But right now, I think the big pattern to take note of, the significant thing to take away, is that ratio of utilitarian versus items of personal adornment. And there are some categories, like the olive shell, for example, right? You have a heck of a hard time, right, utilizing one of those as a pounder, right? So I mean, there's practical ways we can think about that that would make it absolutely true, okay? But as far as an overall pattern, not there yet, but it could happen. And it's a really good thing to be thinking about. Yes?
Is there a difference in the context that you found the utilitarian versus ceremonial?
That's a really good question. The vast majority of the marine shell tools have come from a mound context. So we have some utilitarian tools that have come from the village context adjacent to the mound, but the vast majority, I'd say, out of the 30 items in this sample, 24 of them or so came from a mound. Which is interesting. If you've got a 65-acre village, it's very interesting that all this stuff is clustered around mounds. It almost implies that they're being utilized for ceremony and being strategically placed in an area where the ceremony is taking place, which might end up being exactly what's happening. Right? So it's a good thing to think about. Hi, sure.
So we know that the high status individuals were like wearing a lot of the items with personal adornment, but do you know the social status of the people who were crafting those items, or can you cautiously infer something like that?
I can definitely cautiously infer. I would suggest that they were brought in finished. Okay, which is what usually happened with stone as well. They would bring in either preforms that were close to finished or finished tools. Right? Because the folks that were getting them, I don't believe that they had a lot of people that were there that were specialists in the craft of manufacturing shell tools. I think their specialists would have been specialists in manufacturing bone tools, because they had bone everywhere, right? Their primary raw material for making bone tools was white-tailed deer long bones, right? And those are everywhere, right? All you got to do is go harvest one, right? You got a nice fresh one. I still harvest them today. It's wonderful. Freezer's full of them. Thank God. But yeah, so it's interesting to think about. Since there wasn't a lot of raw material there, since we don't have evidence of debitage, of them doing a lot of reduction on site, I think it's most likely that they were getting these tools in a completely finished form.
So would they then go into reworking them?
That's a good question. Did they rework them on site? I think they did. I think they did. Anybody else? Go for it.
Have you been able to infer anything specific about their beliefs or ceremonies from the artifacts you found?
Oh, goodness gracious. It's a good thing I don't have my ceremonial egg poster with me. There's so, yes. If I start blabbing on that, I'll be here another half an hour. There are icons and symbols that are carved on an artifact from the site that's about the shape of a bird egg, about the size of a bird egg, that I focused on at last year's FAS. I had that poster last year or last year. Anyway, when you look at the icons and the symbols of the story of creation that's associated with a lot of American Indian beliefs, there being three worlds, right? A lower world, a middle world, and an upper world. There being creatures that are associated with those, and colors, creatures, and directions, or oftentimes themes that are associated with that. And as I analyzed the drawings or the carvings on that artifact, I came up with some really interesting consistencies. And that egg appears to depict the three realms that were the focus of their spirituality, and has animals carved on it that are consistent with what we see in carvings from Fort Center, which is a very significant site right adjacent to Lake Okeechobee, that has lots of imported artifacts and was probably, could have been the source of the population for the blueberry site. All right, there was a big problem at the Fort Center site around 1150 AD. Burial ceremonies changed, the hierarchical structure there shifted, the politics got all monkeyed up, maybe improved, maybe worsened. right? But something really significant happened there. And about 50 years later, we've got this stable contingent of people with remnants of metal and other types of artifacts that are very prominent at the Fort Center site. So it's very possible that the Blueberry site came from that residual population of Fort Center. Don't tell anybody that, though. Anything else?
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Butler.
Thank you guys so much.